Welcome back to another episode of Two Hats Podcast. I am the Tactical Probation Officer, and this is my co-host,
Brittany. Hey everybody.
So welcome back to episode 2. We appreciate you guys that subscribe to us, that left some comments in our first episode. We've been getting a lot of positive feedback on our Instagram page. A lot of people are saying, this is something that's needed. A lot of people that are in the field that don't feel like we get as much attention as we should for the roles that we do play in the community. So we are back for another episode, and our plan is to keep this going. All right. So for today's episode, we're going to kind of slow things down, and we're going to talk about what is community supervision / community corrections. Okay. Because when you have those titles, there's a lot of different job titles that kind of go underneath it. So depending on where you are in the country, whether you're, working a local municipality, a county, a state, or even the federal government, there's different jobs that go into community supervision. So we're going to talk about it from the beginning and then all the way to the end. So just a quick breakdown of kind of how the criminal justice system works. So a lot of people know about cops. So criminal breaks into somebody's house. The cops are called. Cops arrest them, take them to jail. They see a magistrate. They get a bond. They either stay in jail till they see a judge, or they're released on bond. They're given a court date, and then at that point, they're convicted. All right. At most, a cop might interact with that offender. How many times do you think a cop would interact with an offender just in the duties of what they do?
With that one particular offender?
Yeah, for that guy that broke into somebody's house and got caught.
It literally might be the first and only time. It could be the first and only time.
That's true. Because from the time they arrest them, if that offender takes a plea and doesn't have a hearing, doesn't go to trial, you're right. That might be the only time the officer ever has an interaction with that offender. Whereas opposed to someone that's in community supervision, man, we get to know that offender. We see them. Man, it could be as little as once a month to as much as 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 times a month.
Exactly. And not only do we know them, we also get to know their family. Don't forget that part.
Exactly, because we have to, big part of our jobs is going to their homes, and their families are there. And towards the end, we're also going to talk about what are called criminogenic needs, and a big part of community supervision is doing risk assessments. So at the end of this podcast, towards the end, we'll talk a little bit about that also. So we're just going through the criminal justice process. You have the arrest, you got the magistrate part, you got the bond part, and you have the court and everything that goes along with it, where it's a plea or trial or hearing, and then at some point the offender is convicted. Okay, so in the beginning, there's what's called pre-trial, and Brittany's going to talk a little bit about that. Then after pre-trial, they get probation. All right. Then if they go to prison at some point, there's what's called parole and post-release supervision at the end. So community supervision starts pretty early in an offender's process in the criminal justice system, and it can be the very end of hopefully the community supervision is the very end of their involvement in the criminal justice system, if they don't recidivate. So I'll turn it over to Brittany, and we can talk about pre-trial.
Pre-trial. Okay, so where I work, more so we refer to it as bond supervision, to be honest. So what that means, the offender has committed a crime, has gone to jail, been magistrated, and the judge has given them a bond. So they are released on bond. But as a condition of that bond, they are required to report to a supervision officer just as they would if they were on regular probation. So those stipulations, they're going to include drug tests. Well, they could include drug tests, monthly meetings. They could include probation fees, curfew. There could be monitoring systems that could be put in place. Maybe an interlock device for the vehicle if it's like a driving while intoxicated offense. So it's very similar to being on regular probation, but the judge has not convicted this person of this crime yet. So they're still going through the court process, but they're still being supervised. A lot of people, they get to this pretrial, this bond supervision state, and they feel like, okay, if I mess up on this, then yeah, there's no chances of me being able to get on regular probation, which is sometimes true. But as a PO, if you are working as a pretrial officer or a bond officer, you're going to be required to do a little background information on this offender. You're going to be required to get their criminal history. You're going to be required to ask them a lot of background information to see if they are fit for regular probation, because not everybody's in a mental state or just able to complete probation. Believe it or not, a lot of people aren't. So as a bond officer or a pretrial officer, you're going to be responsible for that. So where I worked, you were mainly inside the court. You worked really closely with the DA and you worked really closely with the judge to see if this offender will be eligible to be on regular probation or if it's something that they could succeed at. Chris, I know you said that you completed a PSI before, and for you people who don't know what a PSI is, that's a pre-sentence investigation. So like I said, there's some background information that we have to come up with for this person who's committed this crime. So when you did PSIs, like how lengthy was it in your area?
All right, so first of all, I'll take the S off the end. I've done one. I've only done one pre-sentence investigation ever. And it's lengthy. I want to say it was probably about 15 pages, and it was and of course they're different, where you work in your jurisdiction. Okay, I know like pretrial supervision and pre-sentence investigations are really big in the federal probation system. And there's are way more complicated, and way more detailed. But a lot of it was just it kind of goes back to the criminogenic needs that we're going to talk about. There's different categories. So it talks about, it's actually about the offender's education. Did they finish high school? Did they have a GED? Did they do any kind of college? It asks things about employment history. Are they currently employed? What was the last job they had? How much did they make a year? Those kind of things. And it asks about, is there any kind of mental health history? Do they have a diagnosis? Are they on any kind of medication? It asks about substance abuse. Do they have a substance abuse history? Are they for DWI? How much do they drink? Have they ever had treatment for alcoholism? For other kinds of drugs, it asks questions about that. How often do you use? What kind of drugs do you use? It asks about prior criminal history. So a big part of pre-sentence investigations is pulling that offender's criminal history, seeing what have they been charged with in the past and what have they been convicted of, because those are two different things. Police can charge you with a whole slew of things, but you might only get convicted of one or two crimes. So they kind of they want to know both, to kind of see if there's a pattern. Because normally if the cops charge you with something, they charge you for a reason. But of course, when it goes to court, it might get pled down. A bunch of charges might get dropped. That's pretty standard in like a plea agreement. What else? So criminal history, substance abuse, mental health, education, employment. I want to say those are the main categories. And then there's a section where they kind of ask the officer for their opinion, based on your professional opinion from working your job. Do you think this offender would be a good fit for probation, or should they just go ahead and do their time? Maybe that might be the best bet for that offender, because you don't want to set them up to fail. If you have somebody that the judge kind of looks at their pre-sentence investigation like, yeah, you're not gonna succeed at this, it might just be able to go ahead and activate your time, go ahead and sit on down for a little bit. Don't pass go straight to jail, and
Yeah.
we'll holler at you and we'll smile at you. You know what I'm saying? So yeah, I've only done one, and it took me. I want to say it probably took me about a week to do, because I was doing it in between my, working on my regular duties, and just trying to gather all the information. Talking to the offender, calling family members, pulling their criminal history up in the system, calling previous employers and things like that. So, but those are pretty standard, like I said, in the federal probation system, and I think they're pretty big out in California also, from my understanding. But yeah, so now for your pretrial or bond release, did you guys use electronic monitoring?
Well, it was on a case by case basis. It just really depended on the offense and the offender. But it was a big thing, especially for DWI cases and felony cases. So not all misdemeanors were, we had to do the PSIs on, but most all felonies and DWI cases, we had to do that. But I wanted to talk about, before we get into probation, talking about being a PO, probation officer. For a pretrial, some departments you can just strictly do pre-sentence investigations like what Chris was explaining, or do bond supervision or supervise offenders who are going through that process. So there's levels, like he said, to being in probation or to being in community supervision. So if you get into an agency where they have that option of you just being a bond officer or you just being a pretrial officer, that it is from my experience seeing it, because I've never been a bond officer or a pretrial officer, but just from seeing it, it's a high intensity job. Like you're constantly going back and forth with the courts and the offender and the offender's family. So it's a lot. And in my department where I worked, it's actually considered to be a promotion from just being a regular line officer. What about where you work, Chris?
In when I worked juvenile probation in Pennsylvania, juvenile probation, there is no pretrial. There's only probation, juvenile probation, so there's no pretrial. Where I am now, we don't actually have pretrial, but the county itself actually has a pretrial program. So whereas the state system that does probation and parole, we don't have that, but there is a pretrial office that's run by the county. And I think a big part of their responsibility is trying to keep the jail numbers down. So trying to see who's eligible for some kind of electronic monitoring release or some kind of pretrial release. I don't think they go and see the offenders in the field. I think it's mostly I think they mostly do electronic monitoring to make sure that they're living where they said they're living, and they're being responsible, especially for people that are on DV charges that are pending, to make sure they stay away from the victim. That's a big thing too. So
and
yeah,
for those of you who don't know, DV is domestic violence.
Yeah, sorry
Some
about
people
that.
don't
Yeah,
know.
yes, they don't know. Actually, our next episode, we're probably gonna talk some more about specialized caseloads and specialized units, and we're gonna try to have a guest for our third episode. So definitely make sure you tune into that one. But we got to build the bridges. So here we are talking about what community supervision is. All right. So now with bond release. Now, if the offender is violating their bond release, let's say they're on electronic monitoring and they're not doing what they're supposed to be doing, or they're told they can't drink and they're found out to be drinking, what usually happens?
Usually the defendant is taken into custody. So your bond will be revoked, and the offender would have to sit in jail while they're going through the court process.
How often do you think that happens?
Well, with violations, especially if you're on electronic monitoring, that happens quite often. But if you're out there abiding by the rules, there's no violations, then yeah, of course you can stay out. But they don't. Well, in my area, they didn't take lightly people, especially DWI offenses. I don't know why, but in Texas, that's a big thing. That's a big no-no in Texas. You're not to drive while intoxicated. So that has almost a zero tolerance. So if there's a violation with that monitor, or if you're not in the house at the time you're supposed to be in the house, that's a big deal. You're most likely, I would say 9 times out of 10, you're going to be issued a warrant and taken into custody.
All right, so 2 questions, follow up. One is, do you guys have the alcohol monitors that go on their legs and they check to see if they drink? And 2,
Yes.
Who makes that arrest?
Okay, so yes, we do have those monitors for those offenders, and the sheriff's office is they're the ones who make the arrest. So Typically, if an offender comes to the office, for their scheduled meeting with their bond officer, okay, yeah, the arrest can happen there, but it will still be conducted by a deputy. So the sheriff's office would come and they would handle that. So, say for instance, the offender has violated the probation and they're at home or they're out and they're not reporting or something like that. The judge will issue the warrant, and then any arresting agency, any law enforcement officer could arrest that person, and then they will have to be transported to our county.
Okay. Okay. Anything else that you want to add about pretrial or bond supervision? I've never heard that term before. So see, I'm learning things today. I've never heard of bond
Oh, okay.
supervision before.
No, for pretrial and bond supervision, we're good on that. If anybody has any questions about that, please leave them in the comment section below. Chris and I will be checking the comments and we will be responding to everybody. But we are going to move on to probation. So probation is basically when an offender has committed an offense, they've already gone through trial, and the judge has ordered them to be placed on probation. Okay. So this is when you commit, it could be a misdemeanor or a felony offense. So as a probation officer, you will supervise men or women. There's really not, at least in my experience in my area, there's not a preference. You can't choose, oh, I want to supervise male offenders, or I want to supervise female offenders. It's going to be a mixture of both. The age range could be from 17 all the way up to 100, or however old people get. So you can't just like pick a specific group. Chris, in your experience as being an adult officer, do you feel like you had more offenders that were male or female? Or because for me, it was kind of almost like 60-40, I don't know, 50-50 almost.
I think statistically nationwide there are more male offenders than there are female offenders. But
I didn't want to say that, but
I've never heard of, and I'm not saying it's not possible, because I'm sure somewhere in the country maybe they do it like that, but I've never heard of like caseloads divided up by what your sex is. I've never seen that. When I was a juvenile officer, I had males and females. Now there might be situations where depending on what that offender's history is, the supervisor might decide it'd be better for them to be with a male officer or female officer, depending on what their history is. So if you have, let's say you have a female offender that has a history of being abused, they might just for that offender's mental health status go ahead and assign them a female PO. I've actually experienced situations where I've had male offenders that don't get along with female officers whatsoever, whether it's they just can't have a woman be in authority over them, or they're just being highly inappropriate with that female officer, and then they come to me, and I love that. So that's happened that's happened several times when I was a juvenile officer. That's happened several times as an adult officer. And like I said, so besides those off circumstances, normally it's kind of you're put into a rotation, and whatever case comes in, doesn't matter if it's male or female, it gets assigned to an officer based on a rotation. Now, when I was a juvenile officer in PA, we were actually broken up into school districts. So we had officers assigned to different school districts, and that's where your caseload would come from. Now, the area I covered, we had 2 officers, and it just happened to be broken up with my partner Lori. She was a school-based officer, so she had kids that were in the school system, and I had, just the way my caseload was designed, I had kids that weren't in the school system. So these were kids were either in cyber school or they were dropouts, which generally tend to be more high risk because they're not in school, so they're not in a structured environment. Usually their parents are at work during the day, so these kids are out and about committing crimes, being delinquents. So, but generally that's how it is. I do know that some places they do divide offenders out by maybe where they live. If you have like a large county, they might break offenders up by they might break the county up into different zones, and assign the offenders to that PO that's in that zone.
So I
But no,
brought that up about, supervising only men or supervising only women because on my YouTube channel, Your Favorite PO, I've gotten some questions like that. Like, can I choose which type of vendor I supervise? No. In reality, most often, no, you can't. You're going to be supervising both men and women. But probation is for when an offender commits an offense and they're taken to jail, not prison. So if they're released from jail, then they will come to probation if the judge orders that. So that's the difference between probation and parole. A lot of people ask me that, like, what is the difference between being a probation officer and a parole officer? For the offenders that a probation officer supervises comes from the county jail. Right, Chris? Am I right?
that's correct. I mean, and there's also offenders that would never serve a day in jail too. So if they, let's say that guy that from our example, the guy that committed that B&E, right? So he gets to the jail, he meets the magistrate, um, and magistrate sets a bond or gives him an unsecured bond, which is very common now, with everything going on with the Rona, aka COVID-19, aka coronavirus, um, aka coronavirus is real. Depending on uh, depending on about the magistrate feels based on that offender's history and whatever else they look at, they might never set a day in jail. They might get an unsecured bond to give them a court date. And as long as that offender shows up at every court date and does what he has to do, he takes a plea for breaking and entering, or possession of stolen merchandise or whatever it is that they take a plea to, then they might get straight put on probation. So let me ask you, down in your area, how do they determine the amount of I'm trying to figure out how to word this. So normally with probation, well, in adult probation where I am now, you get what's called a suspended sentence, which is, well, you committed this offense by general statute or by the law. This is how much time you would do for this offense, but we're gonna suspend that, which means you're not gonna go serve that time, but instead you're gonna do 12 months supervised probation. Is that how they do it in Texas?
Yep, that's the same way.
In juvenile probation, there is no time that's put on probation. So the way it works in Pennsylvania is this what's called the Juvenile Act, which is the law that governs juvenile offenses and juvenile probation and juvenile court. So the way it works is that by law, the juvenile has to have a court hearing either before a hearing officer or a judge, depending on the type of offense they committed. Like if it's a felony, they have to see a judge. If it's a misdemeanor, um, they see what's called a hearing officer, or they used to call them court masters, which is kind of like a step below a judge. So it's kind of like a magistrate type thing, but it's for juveniles. Um, but they have to hear their case every 6 months. So the way it works in juvenile is, generally the shortest amount of time you could be on probation would probably be about 6 months. Because that's the amount of time by law you have to have a hearing. Now it can be shorter. So let's say you're doing very well. You did whatever you had to do. Let's say you had to do some substance abuse treatment. You had to pay some restitution and get good grades. Your attorney can ask to have a hearing at 3 months, and then you might get off. But at the minimum, every 6 months you'll have a hearing at the minimum. Now, judges generally could order shorter periods of time. So a judge might say, well, I want to see you back here in 3 months. That happens a lot. So the judges feel that they have more control, or more involvement with what's going on with that juvenile.
So as far as probation is concerned, if an offender is coming, let me restate this, okay? So as far as probation is concerned, if an offender is committed a crime and they are coming out of the county jail, or as Chris said, sometimes they're not even serving any time and they're being placed on probation, that's what a PO or probation officer is for. But parole is a whole different beast. Not to say that the offenders that a probation officer supervises can't have a history of being in prison, but parole is to supervise offenders who are released from prison. And then Chris is going to tell us a little bit more about that role. So let's talk, Chris.
Sure. All right. So parole is supervision after incarceration. Okay. So Now the way it works, parole would usually work is, the offender is given a certain amount of time that they have to serve. Let's say they have to serve 5 years in prison, and then they might say, depending on your state, depending on what the state law is, they have maybe a certain amount of percentage. You have to serve a certain percentage of your time, whether it's 90%, 85%, or whatever it is. And then they'll say, at, let's say you serve 5, at 4 years, you're eligible for parole. So the way parole works is that there's what's called the controlling authority. Some states have what are called parole boards, or a parole commission. These are organizations of appointed people, and there's usually a small number of them, that they make these decisions. They look at the offender's history. They might consult with the victim to see if it's appropriate for this person to be released from prison early. The main difference between parole and the new term that a lot of places started using in the early 90s is what's called post-release supervision or post-release community supervision. Or in Ohio, they call it post-release control. So post-release basically means it's post-incarceration. It's time you're serving after you've been incarcerated. And most places now are, post-release is not, let me say, phrase like this. Post-release is, you cannot refuse post-release. Okay. So let's say you're convicted of a crime, you do 90% of your time, and let's say you have 9 months to a year left, they will release you onto post-release supervision. And those times vary by state. Every state has different amount of times you might serve, but it's all time this time you've served in prison, and then you're getting out on supervision. And then the commissioner, parole board, or whatever your state calls it, they'll set the rules and conditions. They're usually pretty similar to probation. You got to do some abuse assessment. You got to check in with your officer. You might have to pay a fee every month. And the main purpose of that is to offer like smooth, meaningful, and comprehensive transition of offenders from incarceration to the community. So the issue they were having was that people go to prison, then they'll do all their time, get out, they don't have no housing, they still have a drug problem, they never learned how to deal with it while they were in prison, because either the prison didn't offer any kind of classes or treatment or NA or AA while they were in there, or they just refused to do it while they were in there. So they still have a drug problem, they're homeless, they have no job, they might not have family to support them. Their family members might have passed away while they were in prison, or they've burned their bridges with their family, so they can't go back home. So the whole purpose of community supervision after prison is to help them with those resources. Where's the homeless shelter? Where is transitional housing? Here is, substance abuse program. Here is a mental health program. So that way they have a smooth transition. Plus, statistically, when they get out of prison, is within that first year is when they're at the highest level of recidivism. So difference between parole and post-release is that with parole, you actually have the option of refusing it. So if you're eligible for parole, you can say, I don't want to do parole, I just want to do my time. I don't want a PO come to check on me. I don't want to have to worry about no curfew. I don't want to worry about an ankle monitor. I don't have to worry about doing some of these classes. I'm just going to sit here for this next 12 months or whatever period of time they have left and get out, and I don't got to worry about none of y'all. Okay? I ain't got to worry about no parole searches. I ain't got to worry about y'all popping up in my house, coming to my job, none of that. And, some people do that. Now, with post-release, there is no option. By law, you got to take it. And if you violate, you go back to prison. You do the rest of your time. So that's kind of how that works. And every state is different. Like in Pennsylvania, there's the county level where there's in the county I worked in, we had juvenile probation. Then we had the adult probation and parole office. Now, they didn't actually do parole as in prison. They did parole as in you were ordered to do a certain amount of time in jail, and then it's usually I think it's less than 2 years. I think you do jail less than 2 years in PA. And let's say you're eligible for, let's say you do a year and a half, those 6 months they consider that parole, but it's jail parole as opposed to like prison parole. And then there's also what's called state parole, which is covers the entire state of Pennsylvania. And they have parole agents that supervise those offenders that were released from prison onto parole. I know in New Jersey, they have probation officers at the county level, which they lean very heavy towards the social worker side. I want to say they're probably like 80-20 over there. So, I mean, we talk about the 50-50 balance between social worker and, law enforcement. They're like 80-20. But they have parole also, which is a separate agency. And I want to say they're probably a good 70-30 towards the law enforcement side, because their primary objective is to protect the community from these people that's got out of prison. So that's really the difference between parole and post-release. They're both after a term of prison. Difference being parole, you can refuse it. Post-release, you can't. And the whole goal of it is to reintegrate the offender back into prison. You might have someone that's did 10 years. When they get out, they don't know what an iPhone is. Shoot, they don't know they don't know YouTube and Zoom and IG. They don't know any of that. They come out and their neighborhood looks different. Like I said, family members have passed away, family members have been born, and a lot of them need help with adjusting back into the community. And that's where community supervision in terms of parole officers or post-release officers come into play.
So that's the beauty of being in corrections or community supervision. There's a wide array of positions that you can take, or even if you start at one, you can move into other ones. So I like to when people ask me, is this a good job? Is this a good field? Is there room to grow and all that type of stuff? My answer is always yes, because when you think of a probation officer, you might think of one thing, but there's actually levels to this, right? As you can tell from what Chris and I have discussed. So maybe you started as a parole officer and you're like, I don't want to do that. You can come over here to the probation side, or you can come over here to bond supervision. Like there's room for growth. There's room to learn a lot of things. So Chris, as far as your experience, okay, you've been a juvenile PO, an adult PO. Is there somewhere you want to go after adult supervision, like somewhere higher, another department?
Me personally, the new position I'm in right now, because I have a specialized caseload, I'm very happy with that. I'm sure, later on in life, when I get older, I might want to be a supervisor.
Now, remind the people what your specialized caseload is.
Right now, I'm working drug court, so I deal primarily with drug addicts that are ordered into drug treatment court, and they have to abide by all the rules of drug court, which is something we can talk about more when we get to our specialized caseload episode. I didn't have a specialized caseload when I was in juvenile. I mean, just the way my caseload was designed, it was more high risk juveniles, but they didn't call it a high risk caseload or anything like that. I was just a regular officer. But we had specialized caseloads in juvenile too. And in juvenile probation, there is generally, well, in PA, there is no parole or post release. The whole thing is called probation. So if a juvenile gets arrested while they're on probation, and the judge sends them to orders them into a juvenile facility to do treatment, like a placement facility. When they get out, they're still on probation until the judge says they're done. So, and the thing is that there is no time limit. So, honestly, man, I had juveniles that I got when they were 14, and I kept them up till they were 18. Yeah.
Dang, that's
yeah. I mean, of course, every 6 months they got their mandatory by law review with the judge, but they would need to keep messing up. Go to placement, mess up there, or they'll come back home, mess up again. It happens. It happens. It's rare, but it can happen.
All right. So to sum up today's episode, we talked about pretrial or bond supervision, probation, parole, or post-release. So if anybody has any questions regarding anything that we talked about in today's podcast, please leave comments down below. Please subscribe to our YouTube, and I will also leave our links to our Instagram, to the Two Hats Podcast, as well as my personal IG, which is your favorite PO, and Chris's IG, which is
the tactical _ probation officer. I had to think about it.
So thank you guys so much for tuning into this week's episode. We will have a new episode for you next Wednesday right here at the Two Hats Podcast. Y'all stay safe.
All right, family, be safe.